If you type Space Force into a search engine, chances are you'll find a trailer for the Netflix show Space Force, or maybe an IMDb or a Rotten Tomatoes page for it. Even if you find anything about the actual US military branch, it's likely to be a comedic bit or an opinion piece poking fun at the whole idea. People find this Trumpian brainchild a bit laughable, and you can't really blame them. I mean, the closest cultural reference we could compare Space Force to were either outlandish sci-fi sagas, disjointingly different from the serious reputation the US military wants to put off, or farces of them. Think Star Wars, Star Trek, or Spaceballs and Galaxy Quest. We don't really need to go on. Sure, there's a precedent in serious US affairs in space with NASA, but Space Force brings in a whole new dynamic of galactic warfare, images of dogfights around Mars, laser guns lighting up the vast darkness, and stuff like nukes on the moon. Oddly enough, one of these things was actually an idea proposed by the military. Stay tuned to find out which one. And of course, it doesn't help that this made-for-TV idea was proposed by a president who used to be on a reality show. All of this begs the question, is this just a big space farce? Well, fire up your curiosity boosters and get ready to beam up some knowledge, Scotty. Today we're examining the latest US military branch. To fully understand anything, we have to first look back at its history. US military space operations started in the aftermath of World War II. Military space development was underway even before the first space flight was a glint in the Kremlin's or the Pentagon's eye. The US Army oversaw the military's air power, but in 1947 the Air Force gained its independence, becoming the fifth branch of the US military. It would remain the most recent for over 70 years. With the Air Force now flying under the power of their own wings, the sky was no longer the limit. The Air Force took responsibility for US space capabilities. It wasn't until 1954, though, that the first official space organization was formed. General Bernard Schreiber, seen as the father of the modern Space Force, commanded the Western Development Division. Over the next decade, US military space forces, though not officially referred to by that name yet, underwent bureaucratic shuffling. The Cold War, congressional budget allocation, interdepartmental competition among branches and military strategizing all influenced who was in charge of US space might. The space race brought with it unprecedented government spending on space development and public interest in everything beyond our atmosphere. Countless launches and missions by both the US and Soviet Union saw a dramatic increase in human endeavors in space. Rockets burned their way out of our atmosphere. Human crafts floated through the vast emptiness. Flags and boot prints marked the moon. For the first time, science left its mark outside our world. But space was seen as that, a scientific frontier. The notion of militarizing space was one that stayed within Pentagon walls. But military capabilities always seem to piggyback off scientific development. The Green US Space Forces saw their first battlefield experience in the Vietnam War. Satellites provided ground and air forces with weather and communications information. However, the Vietnam War experience showed how space capabilities spread across different departments led to inefficiencies. And, of course, cue more bureaucratic shuffling. By the 1980s, space had become a vast domain of human imagination. Star Wars, Star Trek, the blueprints for Trump's later plans riveted audiences. Reagan took his sci-fi fascination into the realm of the real world with his own proposed Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative. This $30 billion dream only succeeded in scaring the military spending out of the Soviets. Under Reagan, though, there were the first whispers of Space Force becoming its own military branch. That's right, Trump's not the first one. He just sort of copied Reagan. The birth of Space Force was not meant to be then. Instead, the Air Force Space Command was formed under the command of, you guessed it, the Air Force. In 1991, the world witnessed the first space war, at least according to Air Force Chief of Staff Merrill McPeak. The first Gulf War, though not fought in space and certainly with a disappointing lack of lightsabers, saw the first effective use of GPS in battle. Satellites in space relayed accurate location information to ground troops, stealth bombers, cruise missiles, and laser-guided smart bombs alike, allowing them to reach their respective locations. These GPS capabilities, a direct effort of US space capabilities, aided UN troops in making quick work of Saddam Hussein's forces. After the success of space capabilities in the First Gulf War, there was a growing movement in the United States political realm to form a more independent Space Corps, still under the command of the Air Force, with the goal of being an independent Space Force later on. Though Space Command developed more autonomy, the hopes of an independent Space Force were deterred by the events of September 11, 2001. With all resources now being directed into the war on terror, the formation of Space Force halted. US space might once again proved a vital tool in the Second Gulf War. In case the US military forgot where Iraq was after the first invasion, they could now pull it up on a map with the click of a button thanks to a more advanced and modern GPS system. The plans for an independent Space Force just continued to sit on the back burner as the 21st century reached its teenage years. However, that all changed with Trump. When he met the National Space Council, an office within the executive branch responsible for space policy, he recommended its formation in his concise, knowledgeable style. In his words, "I said, maybe we need a new force. We'll call it the Space Force." And I was not really serious. Then I said, "What a great idea. Maybe we'll have to do that." I imagine the actual meeting didn't go too differently. In December 2019, the Space Force was born. Congress approved the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act, and Trump signed it into law. Steve Carell, General John Raymond, former commander of U.S. Air Force Space Command and U.S. Space Command, became the first chief of space operations. The institution of the Space Force has been the center of debate ever since its founding. Although it may have come out of left field, there has been history to this decision and even precedent in previous administrations. But this hasn't stopped public discourse from ridiculing it. Even private policy circles have questioned its formation, but not all sides are against the Space Force. So let's take a look at both sides of the debate. The mission of Space Force, as stated on their website, is organizing, training, and equipping Guardians to conduct global space operations that enhance the way our joint and coalition forces fight, while also offering decision-makers military options to achieve national objectives. That's right, Space Force members are absolutely called Guardians. The Army has soldiers, the Air Force has airmen, and Space Force has got Groot and his wise-cracking crew. Sorry, I know, benefits. Space is an incredibly important domain. Since the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first human spacecraft in history in 1957, about 9,000 further satellites from over 40 different countries are now orbiting the Earth. Of those, around 2,500 are US satellites, with 57,000 more projected in the future. That's a lot of space hardware floating around out there. No wonder there's a space debris problem. But it's not just useless junk cluttering the outer reaches of our atmosphere either. The US military showed the vital role of satellite GPS in battle during their two Gulf Wars. Nowadays, militaries are using them for other capabilities too, like aerial intelligence gathering and drone piloting. But satellites have permeated many other aspects of modern life too. They power technologies and apps that offer navigation, delivery, and, well, many services that send you an annoying location request notification. Without satellites, TV would not be a thing. ATMs and gas pumps would go on the fritz, and the internet would basically just go down. Without satellites, you kind of wouldn't be able to stay up to date on the latest mega projects video, which we know would be wildly disappointing for you. Since so many modern capabilities depend on satellites, US infrastructure especially, the US government sees it as a priority to defend them. According to former Secretary of the Air Force Deborah Lee James, quote, "We need to make sure our satellites are resilient against cyber attacks, the possibility of jamming, so that we have better detection should there be a weapon that would be coming toward a satellite so that we can maneuver out of the way. Experts are already worried about offensive and defensive tactics in space, and they are already seeing the beginnings of this space warfare development. In 2007, China shot down one of its own satellites. This move, though damaging only to China's property, alarmed analysts at the Pentagon. Assumedly directed at the US, this was simply to show that if China wants to, they can totally shoot down a satellite. It's kind of like punching yourself in the face to intimidate the enemy. Russia, not wanting to be left out of Space Race 2.0, gave the US a scare of their own. In 2019, a Russian satellite released a second, smaller satellite, like an artificial version of Alien. A couple of months later, in 2020, the two satellites had caught up and were floating next to a very expensive US spy satellite. After some US diplomatic maneuvers on the ground, the Russian satellites floated off on their merry way. However, US Pentagon officials, mid-sigh of relief, received intel of another Russian surprise. The smaller satellite fired a projectile into space. US diplomats raised the issue with their Russian counterparts, marking the first time the US accused another country of a space weapons test. With the world's premier space spacefaring nations embarking on a combined space and arms race, China pulling Fight Club tactics, and Russia unveiling their Russian space nesting doll, it's pretty easy to see the rationale for needing military capabilities to defend US interests in space. And many people in US policy circles felt that the Air Force was doing a poor job. Those in Congress who were in favor of an independent Space Force felt that the Air Force was prioritizing its air power mission over space capabilities. According to Representative Mike Rogers of Alabama, when we asked the Department of Defense for an organizational chart so that we could understand who was involved in making decisions in the national security space enterprise and who was in charge below the level of the Secretary and Deputy Secretary, the answer was, we don't have one. After learning about the importance of satellites, both for military and civilian life, the need to protect them, and the ineffective job the military has been doing on this front so far, who wouldn't support a separate military branch dedicated to just that? Well, there are many critics of the Space Force's birth, some of them in inner government policy circles. The public commentary on Space Force is undoubtedly one-sided. The growing reams of comedians, pundits, and anyone online poking fun at the ridiculous fantasies an actual Space Force conjures up make it seem like some unfortunate remnant of Trump's legacy that future presidents will at some point have to deal with. And you can't really blame people for thinking that. Experts say that creating another military branch out of thin air adds an unneeded layer of bureaucracy with no accompanying justifying benefits. Bureaucracy, according to critics, serves to keep itself alive and justify its existence. On paper, the goal of the Space Force is to streamline space capabilities and command in the interest of better aiding air and ground operations. But the critical assumption is that the Space Force will instead use its resources to serve itself and develop its own power solely in the realm of space. This assumption has historical precedence. After the formation of the Air Force, its leaders soon began butting heads with Army command. The purpose of the Air Force was to streamline air command and capabilities in the interest of better aiding ground operations. But Air Force Command valued decisions and resources that benefited the Air Force above all else. The A-10 plane is an example of this. Army leadership cites this plane as a great air support option for ground operations, but the Air Force commanders saw little benefit to risk assets only to see the Army score a win. The A-10, a low-flying craft, saw Air Force personnel take the risk, Air Force planes take the damage, and Air Force budget absorb the impact of maintenance just so Army forces could achieve their objectives. Air Force leadership has tried many times to retire this aircraft, something the Army is definitely against. Bureaucracy. If someone has to look good, why not me? The fear is that the same phenomena will repeat itself only in space. After all, divisions only create more divide, and it's hard to cooperate across divides. This bureaucratic labyrinth will see the beginning years of the Space Force full of power grabs, resource allocation, and personnel transfers. In short, they'll be busy establishing their identity on the ground rather than their capabilities in space. Deborah Lee James, the same former Secretary of the Air Force who stressed the importance of space power, has expressed her opposition to the formation of the Space Force. Her reasons are the same bureaucratic reasons we just mentioned. So you might have been sitting there watching this video and thinking, well, we're already in space, aren't we? After all, NASA did something, right? Maybe they took us to the moon. And you're right, but that's just another dimension of bureaucratic overlap and competition stemming from Space Force's birth. The militarization of space means a more war-based focus. In tangible terms, that can mean the appropriation of NASA funding and resources for Space Force missions that fringe on NASA's, hostile enemy attention on civilian missions just from association with Space Force's military focus and less of a focus on NASA's scientific work. This too has historical precedent. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik and scored the Cold War victory of the first craft in space, instead of focusing on efforts to take US astronauts to space, the Air Force proposed a top-secret retaliation plan. Their highly strategic and well-thought-out response was, well, let's nuke the moon, shall we? That's right, dropping a nuclear bomb on the moon was a legitimate idea put forth by real people in the actual US military. Nukes really were the answer to apparently everything during the Cold War. If a section of a government with a trigger finger that itchy and who now has an offshoot with an intrinsic interest in proving its power and worth in space is given precedence over the scientific work of NASA, it's scary to think about what will happen in the future. But we love scary. So let's take a look anyway. With its formation, Space Force was gifted a $15.4 billion budget with a predicted increase of $2.6 billion over the next 5 years. The only actions of note the Space Force has undertaken since then is to group together the space capabilities currently spread across the Army, Navy, and Air Force. The resource allocation is projected to see 16,000 personnel travel to what General Raymond calls a lean and agile Space Force. But this isn't all leaders and military strategists have in mind for our new Space Guardians. Although the Space Force was created without a developed theory of warfighting in their theater, something the Marines and Air Force both demonstrated effectiveness at before their formation, experts are having a field day proposing what space warfare will actually look like. It's clear that one of Space Force's primary missions will be to protect US satellites. But what exactly does that look like? One theory proposes that the Space Force launch more satellites into orbit. This would make the loss of a satellite or 3 less detrimental to military operations. In this same vein, the development of smaller and cheaper satellites would make replacing lost ones easier. Another method would be physically to defend satellites from weapons and cyber attacks. This method, beside being very tricky, imagine installing armor or installing hardware on old satellites in orbit around Earth, is legally questionable and certainly politically dangerous. But the struggle to go where no military branch has gone before continues. Space Force leadership is hard at work developing a theory of space warfare and how it will contribute to US national security. There's no question that space is becoming an increasingly important realm, both militarily and in everyday life, but the formation of Space Force begs many questions. Is the financial burden worth it? Will the bureaucratic toe-stepping trip up other departments' objectives? Is Space Force just a self-fulfilling prophecy, creating the militarized environment in space that it was created to protect against? The new Space Guardians are trying us to answer those questions, but until we get those answers, it's just too much fun to have a bit of a laugh at Space Force's expense.
Now, just before you leave today, maybe you're looking for something else to watch, why not check out my new channel called Warographics? Want to know all of the details about some of history's most famous battles and wars? Come join me on Warographics, from Sherman's March to the Sea to Operation Barbarossa. If it's got people fighting each other, or occasionally animals, we will cover it. There is a link below.